Before the palaces of Baghdad glittered under golden light. Before paper changed the world in the hands of Abbasid scribes. There were those who swept the marble floors in silence. This is not a story about caliphs, or poets, or scholars. This is about the ones who carried water before the poets arrived. The men and women whose names were not written, but whose sweat built the empire's shadow. They came from the Black Sea, from Nubia, from the Caspian. Captured, sold, branded, then scattered across the heart of the Abbasid world. Some cleaned the latrines of scholars. Some guarded the harems of princes. Some were trained to fight, and bled for cities they could never call home. This story is not legend. It's not fable. It is history, as real as the call to prayer, as harsh as the desert sun. And it begins not with a name, but with a chain. In the early 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate stretched from the shores of North Africa to the plains of Central Asia. Its cities gleamed with scholarship, trade, and power. But beneath the domes of Baghdad and the gardens of Samarra, another story was unfolding, quietly and without consent. Slavery was not an exception in the Abbasid world. It was an institution, deeply woven into the fabric of empire. It did not start in the caliph's court. It began far from it. In border villages of the Caucasus, boys disappeared on their way to wells. In East Africa, raiders moved under moonlight, snatching girls from riverbanks. Turkic horsemen were captured during wars, chained, and marched toward markets they had never heard of. These people were not criminals. They were currency. The slave trade into Abbasid territory was vast and organized. There were routes, mapped, guarded, and taxed, across deserts, rivers, and seas. Zanj from East Africa were brought through Basra. Slavic captives traveled through the Caspian. Central Asian boys, young, strong, and obedient, were in high demand as soldiers to be. They were transported by camel, ship, cart, or foot, depending on how much the buyer was willing to spend. Some died along the way. No one recorded their names. In the bustling markets of Baghdad and Samarra, slavery did not hide in shame. It was public and visible. Human beings stood in rows. Men opened their mouths and flexed their arms to prove health. Women were undressed by strangers and prodded like animals. Children were judged by how quiet they were. The law permitted it. Islamic jurisprudence of the time recognized slavery, though with certain rules. Slaves could not be Muslim at the time of capture. Masters were advised to treat them well. Some would be freed after years of service. But few ever reached that freedom. Once sold, their fates diverged. Some women were placed in harems. Many served without consent. Others became wet nurses, raising noble children while their own were forgotten. Some were taught to sing, dance, or recite poetry for the pleasure of guests they could not look in the eye. Men were distributed according to skill or physique. Some were assigned to hard labor, digging canals or clearing salt marshes under the blazing Basran sun. Many of these were Zanj, dark-skinned Africans forced into punishing agricultural work. Their numbers would swell, and eventually, they would rise. But that comes later. Others, usually lighter-skinned or of Central Asian origin, were groomed to be military slaves. Mamluks. These were not soldiers by choice. They were trained from childhood to fight, obey, and die on command. They formed elite units loyal only to the caliph, often more trusted than freeborn generals. A boy could go from a cattle herder in Khwarazm to a palace guard in Baghdad within a decade. But between those 2 points lay beatings, drills, isolation, and indoctrination. They were forbidden wives, forbidden homes, and forbidden to speak their native tongue. Identity was burned out. Loyalty was carved in. What made Abbasid slavery unique was not just its scale, but its complexity. A slave could end up sleeping in a gutter, or in a silk bed beside power. Some became scribes. Some became lovers. A few even became rulers of distant provinces. But none of them began with a name. Not one. The official registers of the time rarely listed where a slave came from. Sometimes their origin was mentioned, Turk, Zanj, Rum, Nubian. But never their village. Never their mother. In most cases, their past ceased to matter the moment they were purchased. They were renamed, rebranded, replaced. And yet, they lived. They adapted. They learned to read, to serve, to survive. And some, quietly, remembered who they had been. This is only the beginning. South of the grand mosques of Baghdad, beyond the courtyards of Samarra and the glittering halls of Basra, stretched a landscape few poets dared to write about, the salt marshes. This is where thousands of African slaves, known collectively as the Zanj, were sent. They were brought by ship from the Swahili coast, sold in southern Iraq, and marched into a life of mud, salt, and disease. The soil in these regions was thick with salt and nearly useless for farming. But the Abbasid economy had found a purpose for it: dig the salt out, make the land useful, extract wealth from poison. The work required strength, endurance, and a kind of silent obedience. And so, the Zanj were sent there. They were mostly young men, captured, traded, and broken into obedience. Their backs bore scars from shackles and whips. They spoke dozens of languages between them, but none were understood by their overseers. And so, they learned silence. The days began before sunrise. The men were roused from their straw shelters by shouting guards. Some were barely awake before they were hauling baskets of salt-heavy soil onto wooden sledges. The labor was relentless. Under the rising sun, their skin cracked and bled. Salt clung to every wound, and infection was a slow death. They were given little food. Water was rationed. Escape was futile. The marshes stretched for miles, and even those who fled were often swallowed by mud, illness, or patrols. Few people in the Abbasid elite knew, or cared, what happened in the salt lands. For them, the Zanj were a number, a labor force that didn't speak, didn't vote, didn't rebel. Not yet. The guards were mostly Arab freemen, often harsh, sometimes indifferent. A few came from other regions, hardened men who had been soldiers, now given the task of managing human machines. They were paid to extract work, not show mercy. At night, the marshes were quiet. Too quiet. In those hours, the Zanj sometimes gathered in darkness. Not to plot, yet, but to remember. They whispered the names of their villages. They sang in low voices the songs their mothers had taught them. They buried the dead with cupped hands, no markers, no prayers allowed. And slowly, the memory of who they were, who they used to be, began to ferment into something else. By the year 869, there were tens of thousands of Zanj in the region. Some had been in the salt fields for a decade or more. Others were newly arrived. The conditions had not changed. But something inside them had. Their numbers were large enough to matter. Their anger had no outlet. Their leaders, emerging from among their own ranks, began to imagine what had once seemed impossible. What if they did rebel? The empire was distracted. The Abbasids were embroiled in internal conflict, their caliphate stretched thin by rival factions. Samarra, once their prized capital, was bleeding resources. Troops were stationed far from the marshes. The time, as impossible as it seemed, was right. In the evenings, more gatherings took place. Quiet meetings. Careful oaths. Messages sent by runners, sometimes hidden in bundles of reeds. A name began to circulate among them: Ali ibn Muhammad, a free man, a charismatic preacher who spoke of liberation, of justice, of revenge. He was not one of them by birth, but he knew how to speak to their pain. And soon, they listened. This chapter ends in silence, but it is the silence before the storm. The marshes of salt, once thought to drown hope, were about to boil with it. It began in 869, not with a war cry, but with a whisper. The Zanj had whispered long enough. Now, it was time to move. Ali ibn Muhammad, the man many would call the leader of the Zanj rebellion, had traveled through the southern provinces of Iraq for years. A skilled speaker and master manipulator, he was not himself a slave, but he understood the grievances of the enslaved like he had carried their chains. Ali claimed descent from the Prophet, and with it, a kind of spiritual legitimacy. To the powerless, he offered purpose. To the forgotten, he promised memory. And most importantly, to the enslaved, he promised freedom, land, and vengeance. The Abbasid government ignored him. After all, who would follow a nobody preaching in the marshes? They would regret that underestimation. In the summer of 869, Ali and a growing band of Zanj laborers struck their first target, a lightly defended estate near the canals of Basra. They torched grain stores, looted supply sheds, and killed several guards. It was swift, brutal, and unexpected. That was the beginning. Word spread among the salt workers and field hands. More Zanj fled their work camps and joined the uprising. Ali's force grew from dozens to hundreds, then into the thousands. They were untrained, but they had rage, numbers, and nothing to lose. The marshes, once seen as an isolating trap, became an advantage. The rebels knew the terrain better than any army. They launched ambushes, disappearing into the reeds. They blocked canal routes, raided supply lines, and forced villagers to surrender food and resources. Ali's forces began building their own camps. He assigned roles, distributed captured weapons, and established ranks. This was no longer a riot, it was an army. In Basra, panic began to rise. The city was a vital economic hub of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center for trade, learning, and wealth. It was never built to withstand an internal uprising. The initial response from Abbasid authorities was dismissive. They sent a few hundred troops to contain the rebels. Those troops never returned. The Zanj ambushed them at night, slaughtered most, and looted their gear. For the first time, Abbasid swords and armor were in the hands of the enslaved. Ali's confidence grew. He wrote letters in elegant Arabic, calling himself Commander of the Faithful. He appointed governors to territories they had taken. He told his followers they were no longer slaves, but soldiers of justice. For many Zanj, this was the first time anyone had called them anything but property. The rebellion gained momentum. Villages that once ignored the slaves now feared them. Some local Arab peasants even joined the revolt, not out of ideology, but because they too were poor and angry at the caliphate's taxes and indifference. Ali's forces captured more towns, seizing food, weapons, and hostages. They began setting fire to plantations and estates owned by elites in Basra. Rich families fled to Baghdad, bringing stories of black armies rising from the mud. By early 870, the Abbasids could no longer dismiss the rebellion. It was no longer just about a group of slaves. It was a war. And the Caliphate, distracted by civil wars and court politics, was unprepared. The Zanj controlled key parts of the southern marshes. They built fortified camps, even minted their own coins in later years. Their ranks included not just slaves, but free men, deserters, mercenaries, and dreamers. It was the greatest slave uprising the Islamic world had ever seen. Perhaps the greatest the world had seen since Spartacus. But for the men and women who carried it forward, it was not about glory. It was about never going back to the marshes again. The rebellion had begun. The flames had caught. And they would burn for 14 years. By the year 870, the streets of Basra no longer hummed with confidence. Once a proud city of merchants, poets, and scholars, Basra now watched the horizon for smoke. From the towers of mosques to the benches of tea sellers, one name passed through whispers: Zanj. Caravans that once flowed in from the east now diverted around the marshes. Farmers in nearby villages began abandoning their fields. Local lords hired extra guards. Gates that once stood open to trade were now bolted shut before dusk. The city's wealthy no longer dined under the stars. They feared that those who served their meals yesterday might carry news, or blades, tomorrow. Baghdad, farther north, had tried to remain detached. The capital of the Abbasid Caliphate was too busy with its own troubles. Court factions bickered. Provincial governors schemed. The caliph's grip on the outer regions was weakening, and some had begun to say it aloud. But even in Baghdad, news from the south could no longer be ignored. Reports arrived, fields razed, tax collectors executed, entire convoys vanished into reed-covered silence. The Zanj had grown from nuisance to threat. And worse, other oppressed groups began watching. Not joining yet, but watching. In Basra, tension simmered. The merchant guilds began pressuring local authorities for protection. Some demanded military intervention. Others fled, taking their wealth to safer cities like Wazit or Kufa. The local garrison in Basra, never large to begin with, became overwhelmed. Its officers had little understanding of guerrilla warfare, even less of the marshes. Patrols disappeared. Morale crumbled. Recruits deserted. The rebels were not just fighting, they were winning. Inside the city, fear turned inward. Slaves and servants, mostly domestic workers from East Africa or Central Asia, were suddenly watched more closely. Some masters beat their slaves preemptively. Others tried to show kindness, hoping to buy loyalty. It didn't matter. Many of those enslaved had families in the marshes. Brothers, cousins, sisters. They knew what was happening. And some began slipping out of the city at night, joining the swelling army of Ali ibn Muhammad. Basra was not yet under siege, but it was surrounded by silence. The roads out were unsafe. The rivers were watched. Traders who ventured into rebel zones were sometimes let through, and sometimes not. Abbasid officials sent envoys to Ali, demanding surrender. He ignored them. Instead, he issued his own messages, calligraphic scrolls addressed to the people of truth. He claimed the Caliph had betrayed Islam by allowing injustice to thrive. He framed the rebellion not only as liberation, but purification. This was dangerous. Because for the first time, some common freemen, not slaves, began to murmur sympathy. What if the rebels were right? What if the Caliphate had lost its soul? In Baghdad, the Caliph and his advisors finally convened a war council. Troops were ordered south, but they came too slowly. The government feared a trap, or worse, internal betrayal. A new general was appointed. His name would become known in later chapters. But for now, the Caliphate's response was hesitant. Caught between arrogance and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Ali ibn Muhammad moved boldly. He ordered the construction of a new base, deep in the marshes, surrounded by water channels, with wooden towers and defensive dikes. This was not a camp. It was a capital. A city of rebels. He called it Al-Muqtara, meaning the chosen. There, scribes copied laws. Blacksmiths forged weapons. Artisans sewed uniforms from captured goods. The Zanj now had structure. Their rebellion had a flag, a language, and a home. Basra could hear it breathing. One night in 871, fires were seen in the southern horizon. Villages near the city were burning. Witnesses said they saw shadows marching north. The marshes were no longer distant. They were coming. And yet, the gates of Basra remained closed. Not in defiance, but in fear. The city waited, and hoped it would not be next. The siege did not begin with a declaration. It began with silence, too much of it. By the year 871, Basra was surrounded. The roads were unsafe, the canals patrolled by rebel scouts, and the skies often darkened by the distant smoke of razed villages. The city's people had waited for the Abbasid reinforcements that never came. The Zanj army, under the leadership of Ali ibn Muhammad, now numbered in the tens of thousands. Some were former slaves, others were freemen disillusioned with the Caliphate. Many were veterans of earlier raids, hardened by mud, fire, and blood. From their stronghold at Al-Muqtara, they planned carefully. They did not storm Basra immediately. Instead, they cut off supplies. Merchants stopped arriving. Farmers stopped planting. Famine set in. Tensions erupted inside the city walls, first between rival guilds, then between citizens and soldiers. Panic ran faster than courage. When the Zanj finally moved, they did so without warning. On a morning in September, They attacked from 3 directions, using boats along the canals, rafts across the marshes, and foot soldiers through the southern gates. They were met with resistance, but not enough. The defenders were outnumbered, demoralized, and disorganized. Within hours, the outer districts fell. Fires spread across warehouses, stables, and the eastern market. The cries of the dying drowned in the roar of flames. By noon, the central mosque had been seized, its minaret used as a lookout for incoming Abbasid reinforcements that never arrived. The fall of Basra was not merely a victory, it was a message. Ali ibn Muhammad ordered that the city be stripped of wealth and sustenance. Granaries were emptied. Tax offices were burned. The mansions of wealthy landowners were looted. Some were left alive, most were not. And then came the revenge. According to multiple chroniclers, the Zanj carried out a massacre. Guards, government officials, and prominent citizens were dragged from hiding places and executed in the squares. Entire families disappeared overnight. Blood soaked the alleys. The canals turned red. This was not random cruelty. It was deliberate retribution. For decades, the Zanj had labored under Basran masters. Their sweat had irrigated these fields. Their backs had broken for these men. And now, they returned, not as laborers, but as conquerors. Ali tried to exert some control. He issued proclamations forbidding indiscriminate looting. He declared that free Muslims should be spared if they did not resist. But in the chaos, many such orders were ignored. The city was not just sacked. It was unmade. Scholars later wrote of the great silence of Basra. For weeks after the fall, no official letters came from the city. No traders left its gates. Baghdad received only rumors of corpses piled in wells, of soldiers crucified on palm trunks, of entire neighborhoods deserted. The Caliph was forced to act. A full military campaign was now inevitable. Orders were sent across the empire: raise armies, tax the provinces, secure the rivers. Basra had fallen, and with it, the illusion that the Zanj rebellion was containable. Ali, from his stronghold, now governed not just marshland, but a city. He appointed judges, managed grain distribution, and maintained garrisons. He was, in every sense but name, a ruler. Yet he knew what would come next. The Abbasid state, humiliated, would bring its full force to bear. The caliphate might be slow to move, but when it did, it crushed rebellions without mercy. Ali had taken Basra. But he had also painted a target across his entire movement. Still, for that brief moment in 871, the impossible had happened. A slave army had taken one of the great cities of the Islamic world. And the world, watching in disbelief, realized that the Zanj were not a footnote in history. They were now writing it. The fall of Basra was not just a military loss, it was a public humiliation. When the news reached Baghdad in late 871, the court of Caliph al-Mu'tamid fell into stunned silence. One of the caliphate's oldest and wealthiest cities had been taken by former slaves. It wasn't just unthinkable, it was dangerous. For months, ministers had downplayed the Zanj rebellion. They called it a local disturbance, a matter of marshes and outlaws. But now, there were no more excuses. A rebellion that once festered in the mud had seized a major urban center, slaughtered officials, and proclaimed its own rule. The Caliph had no choice but to act. Within days, proclamations were sent out across the empire. The Zanj rebellion was declared a threat to the Ummah. Governors were ordered to raise troops. Treasury officials were told to release funds for weapons and provisions. Letters were dispatched to tribal leaders, asking for loyalty and support. This was not just a rebellion. It was war. Al-Mu'tamid appointed his brother, Al-Mu'afak, to lead the campaign. Al-Mu'afak was no mere noble, he was a seasoned commander, known for his ruthless efficiency and political savvy. He took personal charge of the mobilization. Under his direction, the Abbasid army began to move. Tens of thousands of soldiers were summoned: Turkish cavalry, Persian archers, Arab infantry. Supply routes were established. Engineers were sent to study the marsh terrain. Naval divisions were assembled to navigate the canals and rivers. The military build-up took time, but it was unprecedented in scale. Meanwhile, in the rebel capital of Al-Muqtara, Ali ibn Muhammad prepared. He knew the caliphate would come for him. He doubled defenses, trained new recruits, and stockpiled supplies. But he also understood that his movement could not match the empire's resources. So he relied on speed and surprise. Zanj raiding parties continued to strike deep into Abbasid territory. They targeted villages, disrupted canal traffic, and ambushed smaller patrols. They aimed not to defeat the empire directly, but to weaken it piece by piece. The marshes remained the Zanj's greatest weapon. Abbasid generals, unfamiliar with the terrain, found themselves bogged down. Roads turned to sludge. Horses drowned. Boats capsized. Even experienced troops struggled in the shifting mud and labyrinthine waterways. The war dragged into 872 and 873. Battles were fought, towns changed hands, but victory remained elusive. The Zanj avoided direct confrontation. They moved like smoke, appearing, striking, vanishing. Al-Muwaffaq grew impatient. He ordered a slow, grinding campaign: seize control of canal routes, build floating bridges, establish forward bases, and starve the rebels into submission. The Abbasids built fortified posts throughout southern Iraq, inching closer to Al-Muqtara. At the same time, they waged a propaganda war. Abbasid poets composed verses denouncing the rebellion. Mosque preachers condemned Ali ibn Muhammad as a false prophet. Government scribes distributed pamphlets warning citizens not to support the rebels or face death. But the Zanj held firm. In Al-Muqtara, life went on. Children were born. Markets operated. Judges settled disputes. Letters from rebel officials carried the seal of a government in exile. It was as if an alternative caliphate had sprung up in the marshes. Some in Baghdad began to worry. If the Zanj could hold Basra and rule from their own city, what message did that send to other oppressed peoples? What if the Kurds, the Berbers, the poor Arab peasants, what if they rose up too? Al-Muwaffaq knew time was running out. By 874, he had assembled a war machine: ships, siege engines, armored divisions, all pointed at one goal: crush the rebellion. Not just defeat it. Erase it. Still, Ali ibn Muhammad refused to yield. In one letter, he wrote, "They call us slaves, but we are the ones who have broken the shackles. They call us rebels, but we are the ones who restore justice." The lines were clear now. Empire versus outcast. Power versus memory. The Caliph had answered. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was coming for the heart of the marsh. Al-Muqtara was never meant to last. It began as a swamp-side camp, then grew into a fortress. By 875, it had become the heart of the Zanj rebellion, a city in the marshes, defended not just by walls and dikes, but by hope. And now, it was surrounded. The Abbasid campaign, led by Al-Muwaffaq, had spent nearly 2 years preparing for this moment. Bridges had been built. Supply lines secured. Marshland maps revised again and again. Soldiers were rotated in fresh waves from across the empire. They came not just to win, but to erase. The siege began slowly. Abbasid engineers erected wooden towers across the canals, using barges as floating bases. Archers and slingers positioned themselves in these watchtowers, cutting off access to river routes. The marshes, once a shield for the rebels, had been turned into a trap. Ali ibn Muhammad stood his ground. Inside Al-Muqtara, the rebels held firm. They had dug trenches, reinforced walls with packed mud and timber, and created internal granaries stocked with years' worth of supplies. Children helped carry water. Women served as nurses. Scholars wrote decrees. A society under siege, but still intact. By all accounts, morale remained high. At night, fires glowed from the towers. Zanj scouts crept into enemy lines to gather news. Songs were sung in the narrow alleys, laments of lost brothers, oaths to never return to chains. And somewhere in the city, Ali himself remained unseen but omnipresent. His voice echoed through town squares, "They think us weak, but we have already done what they thought impossible." But time was the caliph's greatest ally. Weeks turned to months. The rebels, though resolute, began to fray. Supplies ran low. Disease spread in the stagnant water. With every passing day, the Abbasid blockade tightened. Skirmishes broke out along the perimeter. Zanj fighters launched daring raids to break through, sometimes succeeding, often failing. Abbasid troops responded with brutal efficiency. No mercy was shown. Captured rebels were executed on the spot or displayed along the rivers as warnings. Inside al-Muqtara, desperation grew. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that Ali had fallen ill. Others feared betrayal from within. A few even spoke of escape, of slipping away into the marshes. But most stayed. Not out of fear, but out of principle. This was their city, their story, their stand. Al-Muwaffaq, too, understood the cost. Every soldier sent into the marshes risked drowning or ambush. The siege dragged his forces thin. Supplies were hard to maintain. Morale among his men faltered. Baghdad had grown restless, demanding victory. So he changed tactics. Rather than storm the walls, he sent envoys. "Lay down your arms," they called from the banks. "Return to Alo, and the Caliph will show mercy." But Ali refused. Not with words, but with silence. He did not answer. His banners stayed raised. Then came the fire. The Abbasids ignited the reed beds surrounding al-Muqtara, hoping to smoke out the defenders. The flames crept like serpents across the marshes, thick and black. Rebels fought to contain it, digging canals, drenching walls, praying for rain. But still, the city endured. It was not yet a tomb. It was a symbol. And as long as it stood, so too did the dream that once, just once, those at the bottom could stand taller than their masters. In the early weeks of 883, a thick silence hung over the marshes. For nearly a decade, the fortress city of al-Muqtara had defied an empire. Now, it stood on the brink, starved, scorched, and surrounded. The dream that once burned brightly among the rebels had dimmed into flickering embers. The Abbasids had not stopped. Under al-Muwaffaq, the noose tightened week by week. More reinforcements arrived. Canal routes were fully controlled. Outposts pressed in on all sides. No messenger could leave. No trader could enter. The siege had become absolute. Inside the city, hope ran dry. Grain stores were empty. Clean water was rationed. Disease crept through the alleys, taking the young and the old first. Some rebels whispered of surrender. Others clung to their faith with clenched fists and silent prayers. Ali ibn Muhammad remained a shadow. By then, his voice was rarely heard in public. He had grown sick, some said, wasting away from illness or grief. Others claimed he was still planning, still directing defenses from a chamber deep within the fortress. His image had become half leader, half legend. On a grey morning in August, the Abbasids launched their final assault. Boats filled with armored troops moved down the narrow canals. Siege towers, dragged for months across mud and water, were brought to the outer walls. Archers blackened the sky. The sound of drums, deep and thunderous, rolled across the marshes like distant thunder. The defenders fought back. With nothing left to lose, the Zanj made their last stand. They poured boiling oil from the walls, lit fires at entry points, and met swords with bare hands when steel ran out. But the numbers were overwhelming. The siege had drained them of strength. The enemy was endless. By nightfall, the outer district had fallen. Within hours, Abbasid soldiers poured into the heart of the city. Homes were ransacked. Streets were stained red. The mosques, once filled with rebel proclamations, now rang with the clash of metal and the screams of the dying. Ali ibn Muhammad was found that same evening. Accounts differ. Some say he was captured in prayer, others claim he tried to flee in disguise. But all agree on one point: he did not resist. He was brought before Al-Muwaffaq in chains. His eyes, it was said, remained calm. There was no trial. Ali was executed within hours. His head was sent to Baghdad and displayed as a warning. His body was burned. His name was stripped from official memory, written only in the margins of chronicles as a cautionary tale. But Al-Muqtara did not vanish easily. The Abbasids destroyed it brick by brick. What could not be burned was drowned, canals redirected, walls pulled into the swamp. Survivors were either killed or sold back into slavery. The marshes, once alive with chants of defiance, returned to silence. Yet even in defeat, something had changed. For the first time, the empire had been shaken from below. Not by princes or generals, but by the forgotten. The rebellion had lasted nearly 15 years. It had taken entire armies, entire fortunes, to crush it. And though the name Zanj would fade from banners, their story remained. In secret songs. In whispered stories passed among the enslaved. In the eyes of those who dared to remember what happened when the broken stood up and broke something back. History would write Ali ibn Muhammad as a rebel. But to those who lived under chains, he was something else. Not a hero. Not a saint. Just proof that resistance was possible. Even in the mud. The fall of Al-Muqtara in 883 did not end slavery in the Abbasid Caliphate. It ended a rebellion. In the months following the city's destruction, the Abbasid court celebrated its victory with a carefully crafted narrative. The Caliph scribes called it the restoration of divine order. Poets wrote verses praising Al-Muwaffaq's leadership. His name was immortalized in palace frescoes and coins. But for those who had fought, survived, or simply witnessed the events, it was not so simple. Thousands of Zanj survivors were captured in the aftermath. Many were executed publicly in Basra and Wazit. Others were marched back to labor camps. Some were sold into slavery again, quietly returned to salt flats and sugarcane fields. No amnesty was granted. The state did not forgive rebellion. Yet something had shifted. The Abbasids had been forced to reckon with the very system they had built. For more than a century, slave labor had been treated as a silent machine, endless bodies from East Africa and beyond, shipped up through Basra, used and discarded. But now, those bodies had spoken. Officials quietly began drafting reforms, not abolition, but restriction. Some governors discouraged the mass import of East African slaves into the marsh provinces. Others enacted quotas or shifted to paid labor for canal work. It wasn't out of guilt. It was out of fear. The Zanj had shown what desperate people, united by pain, could accomplish. But memory is a fragile thing. In the decades that followed, the story of the rebellion was softened, censored, or erased. Official court histories downplayed its scale. Chroniclers minimized the Zanj, reducing them to faceless rioters or puppets of Ali ibn Muhammad's ambition. Some texts ignored the rebellion entirely. And yet, the story lingered. Not in libraries, but in oral histories. Among slaves who whispered of Al-Muqtara as a city of resistance. Among poets in the south who sang old songs about freedom in the marshes. Among communities along the Shat al-Arab, who passed on tales of the firestorm that once shook the empire. Even in the Abbasid heartlands, unease remained. The Caliphate had crushed the Zanj, but at a cost. Troops had been drained. Fortunes spent. Trust broken. In the years that followed, rebellions flared elsewhere. The Qarmatians in Bahrain, Shi'i dissent in Kufa, tribal unrest in Syria. The idea of challenging Abbasid authority was no longer unthinkable. The shadow of the Zanj remained. Al-Muwaffaq died in 891, praised as a savior of the empire. But he never saw peace. His final years were spent battling fresh unrest. His son, future Caliph al-Mu'tadid, would rule over a caliphate in decline, its golden age slowly fading. As for Ali ibn Muhammad, he became a ghost. No statues were built. No grave was marked. But in the minds of those who remembered, he was more than a man. He was a question. What happens when the lowest rise? What price does an empire pay to silence them? And perhaps most haunting of all, what would have happened if they had won? In the years after the Zanj rebellion was crushed, the marshlands of southern Iraq grew quiet again, but it was the kind of silence that remembers. The canals, once the arteries of resistance, returned to their muddy routines. Small fishing villages sprang back to life. Barges loaded with rice and salt floated between Basra and Wazit. The empire, eager to pretend the uprising had been a flicker rather than a fire, pushed forward. But memory lingered in the riverlands. Travelers along the Shatt al-Arab began to notice odd customs among the villagers. In some hamlets, lanterns were floated on the water during certain nights, said to honor those who once stood tall in the reeds. Children repeated rhymes about a ghost city that had vanished into the swamp. Few said the name Al-Muqtara aloud, but its shape hovered in conversation like mist over a canal. The Abbasid officials took note. In secret correspondence, provincial governors reported signs of unrest, not rebellion, but remembrance. Murals carved into the walls of river homes showed crude images of chained men breaking free. Songs sung in work gangs carried strange rhythms, defiant, slow, hard to trace. It wasn't insurrection. It was identity. And it could not be killed with swords. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, the court moved on. The Caliphate was facing other fires, sectarian tensions in Kufa, tribal power struggles in Syria, cracks in the eastern provinces. The memory of the Zanj was treated like an embarrassment. Even when mentioned, it was cloaked in euphemism, the events of the marshes. Yet quietly, things changed. Slave markets in Basra saw fewer shipments from East Africa. Some merchants began favoring slaves from other regions, Central Asia, the Caucasus, believing them to be less dangerous. Plantation owners reluctantly hired local freemen for canal maintenance. The old system remained, but thinner, more cautious. Still, the riverlands watched. It was in this uneasy calm that a new generation grew up, young men and women whose parents had once fought or fled from the rebellion. Some bore scars. Others bore stories. Many bore both. They did not plan revolution, but they remembered. One such young man, whose name was not recorded, carved a figure into the prow of his fishing boat, a chained hand, open and rising. A merchant woman in Basra, descended from rebels, secretly paid scribes to write down accounts of the rebellion in coded language, hiding them within poetry scrolls. In a marshland school, an imam refused to erase a student's essay titled "The Day the Slaves Spoke." He said nothing when questioned by officials. He simply smiled and asked, "Did they lie?" The state cracked down when it could. A work song banned here. A storyteller arrested there. But it was like catching water with bare hands. The echoes kept returning, through stories, gestures, habits. Not as a call to arms, but as a refusal to forget. And so the rebellion lived on, not in the halls of power, but in the slow drift of the river, the rustle of the reeds, the hush between oar strokes at dawn. It lived not in glory, but in dignity. There were no monuments to the Zanj. No coins bore their image. No mosque bore their name. Their rebellion had been erased from marble and scroll alike. But even without stone, memory had weight. In the city of Wazit, decades after the fall of Al-Muqtara, a potter passed down a broken bowl to his son. It was plain, cracked near the base. But the father explained it had been made during the siege, shaped from marsh clay, fired in stolen heat, used by rebels. It fed a man who fought, he whispered. That son never spoke of it aloud, but he kept the bowl and told his daughter when he was old. Across the Caliphate, among the enslaved and the free poor, fragments of the rebellion endured in objects, sayings, and silences. A knife hidden in a wall. A song with a verse missing. A name given to a child, Muqtar, the chosen. These were not declarations of war. They were reminders that someone, once, had said enough. Even among those far from the rebellion, its echo changed things. In the salt fields near Samara, overseers noted how workers had begun rotating their shifts themselves, refusing to collapse from exhaustion. They did not strike. They simply organized. When questioned, they said nothing, only that we do not wish to die like the Dark Ones. The phrase was cruel, but the sentiment held power. In Kufa, a preacher spoke about justice during Friday's sermon and used the Zanj as a parable, not of sin, but of desperation. He did not praise them, but he did not condemn. A house that cracks under its own weight, he said, should not blame the floor. He was fined, not imprisoned. That was the new rule. Control the story, not the storyteller. Abbasid chroniclers in Baghdad began to reshape the rebellion into something distant. They painted it as an anomaly, a trick by a cunning man who used ignorant slaves. Ali ibn Muhammad was called a magician, a false prophet, a Persian impostor. The Zanj were made small again, tools, not people. But not everyone accepted that version. In southern libraries, guarded by scholars with long memories, older scrolls were kept in shadowed corners. Accounts from merchants, letters from frightened governors, early field reports, all marked in faded ink. Some were smuggled to scholars in Khorasan. Some were read by curious sons of noblemen who asked too many questions. Most were forgotten. But not all. In one record, a tax official described a slave woman in Basra who wore a charm carved with a single symbol, a reed rising from a broken chain. When asked about it, she smiled. "It was my grandmother's," she said. "She told me it means we are not just hands. We are memory." The official filed the report. The charm was confiscated. But the story stayed in the margins. And margins have a way of surviving. Time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it buries them, under routine, under silence, under the day's labor. But buried does not mean gone. And in the decades after the Zanj rebellion, the Caliphate found itself living alongside a memory that refused to die. They called it the Quiet Years. There were no uprisings, no open defiance. The empire appeared calm. But among the poor, the enslaved, and even the scholars, a strange murmur moved through the land. Not of rebellion, but of memory retold in hushed tones. Children in Basra sang skipping songs with lyrics that made no sense to their teachers. Verses about black sails in the swamp or the city with no master. When asked, they shrugged. "It's just a song," they'd say. But some elders winced. In Wazit, a stonemason engraved a new house with a pattern of broken chains behind floral borders. Decorative, he claimed. No one believed him, but no one questioned it either. Not openly. In the bustling port of Siraf, sailors from East Africa began carving reed symbols into their boats before sailing upriver. For the ancestors, they would mutter. Abbasid port inspectors noted it, frowned, then passed them through. The rebellion had become folklore. Yet that folklore had teeth. In marketplaces, storytellers spun tales of a swamp king who rose from the mud to challenge an empire. In some versions, he was a sorcerer. In others, a prophet. In the most daring, he was just a man, tired, furious, alive. Ali ibn Muhammad's name was rarely spoken. But in certain villages, the term Muqtari emerged as slang for someone stubbornly defiant. "Don't be a Muqtari," mothers warned their sons. But some sons smiled when they heard it. The Caliphate noticed. A brief attempt was made to reframe the rebellion as a divine punishment for imperial sins, an experiment in self-revision. But it failed. The story had passed out of the state's hands. It now lived in the mouths of the many. Shaped, stretched, softened, but never erased. Scholars debated whether this memory mattered. Some said it was harmless, a whisper of the past with no threat. Others argued the memory itself was rebellion, that remembering pain is its own form of defiance. One historian, writing under a false name, called it the resistance of truth. His manuscript vanished weeks later. But traces remained. A cracked tile in a madrasa courtyard bore the faint carving of a burning marsh. No one could explain it. A book of herbal remedies in Mosul had a marginal note, "The reeds remember." A wall in a prison yard had initials etched deep, Aim. Ali ibn Muhammad? Perhaps. Or perhaps just a man who remembered someone who had once marched through the swamps with a dream and a chain in his hand. The caliphate aged. Its golden dome dulled. Provinces pulled away. The center no longer held. But in the borderlands and riverbanks, among the ones who were never meant to be written about, the whisper continued. And it would not stop. Because the truth, once buried, does not rot. It waits. And it learns to speak in quieter tongues. In the great city of Baghdad, learning was sacred. The House of Wisdom stood like a beacon, scrolls, star maps, philosophical tracts, translations from Greek and Sanskrit and Persian. Knowledge flowed through its halls like water in the Tigris. But even here, there were things that could not be said. And among the forbidden subjects, none was more delicate than the Zanj. It was not that they were completely erased. A careful researcher might find a footnote in a treatise on provincial taxation, or a coded reference in a scribe's margin. But the full weight of what had happened, the fire, the rebellion, the temporary fall of cities, had been tucked beneath layers of silence. Still, some sought to unearth it. A young scholar named Harith, recently appointed to copy historical texts, discovered a damaged scroll in the back of a storage room. Its title had been scraped off. The pages were brittle. But as he read, phrases leapt out like embers: camp of reeds, chain turned blade, chosen among the forgotten. He paused. Harith brought it to his superior, an aging historian named Yakut. The old man's eyes lingered on the first page before he quietly rolled the scroll shut. "Let it sleep," he said. But Harith couldn't. That night, he returned and began copying the scroll by hand, in secret. Each word he transcribed felt heavy, as if he were pulling stones from a riverbed. He read of Ali ibn Muhammad, not as a sorcerer or impostor, but as a man who had written poetry, delivered sermons, led councils. He read of women who fought beside men, of cities built from nothing, of children born free for the first time. It didn't sound like a myth. He began to question his teachers. Why was this not taught? Why had the empire buried it? One day, he asked aloud. Yakut sighed. Because if it is true, then everything we've said about order, loyalty, and divine right begins to tremble. And empires fear tremors more than they fear war. That week, Harith was reassigned to work on botanical manuscripts. But copies of the scroll began to appear, anonymously. First in Basra. Then in Kufa. Then even farther, carried by merchants or hidden in shipments of ink and parchment. Most were confiscated. But not all. Other scholars joined the quiet revival. A woman mathematician in Ray hid rebel verses in her equations, subtle wordplay in the margins of algebraic proofs. A calligrapher in Damascus copied rebel poetry into decorative patterns, disguised as religious metaphor. A traveling Faqih lectured on justice using parables with oddly specific references. When the lowliest among us built their own city, did the sky fall? He was chased from 3 towns. Still, the work continued. In one madrasa, a group of students staged a secret reading of the scroll beneath the library stairs. They whispered each line like prayer. When one student asked, "But what became of them?" another replied, "We're still finding out." And perhaps that was the truth. The Zanj were gone. Their cities burned, their leaders executed, their story nearly erased. But the echo of their defiance, through chain and verse, silence and scroll, had entered the bloodstream of history. It lived in books that smelled of smoke. In corners of libraries where dust clung too thickly. In the pause before a teacher answers a brave question. The empire still ruled. But its grip was no longer total. Some truths cannot be killed. They only wait for the right reader. They were never meant to be remembered. The Zanj were supposed to vanish. Like smoke. Like mud washed away in the flood. That was how the empire wrote its history. Victors engraved in marble, rebels scattered like ash. But some things refused to stay buried. In a village near the Shat al-Arab, a woman named Barira sang lullabies to her granddaughter. The melodies were sweet, but the words strange, about a city with reed walls, about fires that lit the night not with destruction, but with hope. Her neighbors never asked where the songs came from. But they listened, quietly, through the shutters. In a mosque in Ray, a janitor swept the prayer hall before dawn. Sometimes, when alone, he recited a line under his breath, the hands that built their own freedom. He didn't know its origin. It had been taught by his father, and his father before that. In the far western town of Ifriqiya, a teacher told his pupils that every people has two histories, one written in books, and one carried in bodies. Which one is more true? A student asked. The teacher smiled sadly. The one they try hardest to erase. And in Baghdad itself, amid the towering minarets and marble domes, a young girl passed through the marketplace holding a small token, a charm shaped like a reed, broken in the center. She didn't know why her mother gave it to her. Only that she was told never to lose it. No monuments were ever built for the Zanj. But across the empire, in places maps did not name, the story endured, in songs, trinkets, habits, words half forgotten and half whispered. It lived in the way a laborer paused before obeying. In how a mother gave her child a name that no scribe could trace. In the silence after certain questions. Ali ibn Muhammad was long dead. His city of al-Muqtara was swallowed by the swamp, its wooden defenses eaten by rotten time. But the dream he carried, the idea that the forgotten could rise, that dignity did not require permission, had entered the bloodstream of memory. The Abbasid Empire, for all its might, could not unwrite that. Years passed. Dynasties shifted. The house of wisdom fell. Libraries burned. But every so often, in the corners of history, a phrase would appear again. A pattern. A name. A song. And those who noticed would ask, who first spoke this? Where did it begin? And someone, somewhere, would whisper, there was once a people in the marshes who would not kneel. That was the inheritance. Not victory, but memory. And in memory, they still stood. History is not a fair record keeper. It honors emperors with monuments, scholars with manuscripts, generals with epics. But what of the laborer who lifted stones in silence? What of the woman who hid verses in her child's lullaby? What of those who bled, built, and vanished? The Zanj Rebellion was one of the largest uprisings of enslaved people in human history. It lasted nearly 15 years, shook the foundations of the Abbasid Caliphate, and carved a name for the forgotten into the stone of time. And yet, their stories did not survive in state chronicles. Their names, their poems, their dreams, most of them never written down. Most of them lost. But not entirely. Because sometimes, a truth can be so loud, even silence remembers it. The Zanj were not saints. They were not perfect. But they were people. Enslaved. Exploited. And when they had nothing left, they still dared to fight for dignity. For space. For the right to be seen not as tools, but as souls. They were crushed. The empire survived. The palaces stood. But cracks formed. Whispers remained. And in the margins of history, where dust settles thicker, and footnotes fear to tread, their presence lingers. So when we speak of the Abbasid Golden Age, let us also speak of the salt fields. When we praise the scholars, let us not forget the hands that copied their words with chains still at their wrists. And when we read of rebellion, let us not ask only who won, but also who was forgotten in the telling. This story was not one of triumph. It was one of memory. And perhaps that is enough. Because as long as someone remembers, as long as a name is whispered in the dark, a people are never truly gone. To the Zanj, to the ones who labored, fought, fell, and endured. This remembrance is for you.